We want to discuss and investigate into the performance of regional design within that conference. And with my lecture today, I want to sketch or draw some building blocks of a conceptual background for that conference. And I would be glad to discuss this conceptual background later with you, because it's only a preliminary concept. We are still in the working phase, and I think it will be an ongoing work during the next month. So the first question that one might pose is, what exactly is regional design? We find something like regional design as a current planning activity, planning practice in some European regions. Here you find 4 examples: Le Grand Paris, the Zurich metropolitan area, the Amsterdam metropolitan region, and the Ruhr area. These are some of the visualizations that came out of these regional design processes. These design processes have a strong collective and communicative dimension, and its results, the regional design visualizations or spatial representations, are in only rare cases, or mostly there are no plans to be implemented. They rather have a strategic, orienting and communicative function. So, but what exactly do we know about regional design? We may ask this question as academics involved in teaching, involved in research, but we may also ask that question as practitioners. So a first perspective would be, what do we have sufficient experience from regional design practice? Experience that gives maybe recommendations for future regional design activities. Experience that might tell us something about the performance and impact of regional design. A second perspective is, what about teaching regional design? What didactics are adequate and stand the test? A third perspective, can we formulate a program to regional design from an academic perspective? Will there ever be a handbook, a manual to regional design? And last but not least, how can we evaluate the performance and impact of regional design? How to guide research into the performance of regional design activities? This is a conceptual challenge, but also an empiric challenge in research. So we have touched upon all of these 4 perspectives in recent years at our university in our cooperation with Anna Tierstein. Nevertheless, we are far from knowing. We have much more questions about that. Some years ago, we published this book, The Image and the Region, Making Megacity Regions Visible. Sonnefeld already mentioned that book. This book was a tentative answer to the challenge of governing polycentric megacity regions, such as Peter Hall and Kathy Payne defined them. And this definition is as follows: megacity regions are a series of anything between 10 and 50 cities and towns, physically separate but functionally networked, clustered around one or more larger central cities and drawing enormous economic strength from a new functional division of labor. These places exist both as separate entities in which residents work locally, and most workers are local residents, and as parts of a wider functional urban region that is connected by dense flows of people and information that is carried along motorways, high-speed rail lines, and telecommunication cables. And this definition already points to one major challenge. Megacity regions are highly invisible. Their constituent elements are functional relationships that link, physically separate cities and regions. And as a consequence, megacity regions have many faces. They have manifold parts such as urban centers, new urban landscapes, semi-rural areas, and clusters of business districts and hub airports. Furthermore, they are highly polycentric and discontinuous. So the book was our preliminary answer to the invisibility of these megacity regions. The program of making megacity regions visible wants to support building up awareness and identity for the new spatial scale of megacity regions. The book addresses professionals from different disciplines as well as politicians and administrators. And the book presents the work program of making megacity regions visible in 14 chapters from different authors: architects, spatial planners, geographers, designers, photographers, and communication specialists. So the work program included a variety of different skills and approaches. Making visible is conceived as a multi-layered program. So what does that mean for regional design? Is regional design a combination of these different ingredients? We know that regional design has a strong spatial dimension. Consequently, spatial representations, or what we called it also visualizations, they play a key role. And we know that spatial representations exert different functions. Spatial representations have a design capacity. Of course, they are elementary to any design process. But beyond that, they have an analytical capacity, for example, for the pattern recognition of regional data. And beyond that, spatial representations have a strong normative or political and organizational capacity. And when we deal with regional design, we can be sure that these different dimensions never come alone, but will always overlap and intertwine. So when we talk of the practice of regional design, what can we observe? Regional design has a strong future dimension. Regional design is about shaping an intended regional future. At the same time, regional design operates across multiple administrative boundaries at the scale of a functional region. Design has to deal with complex multi-level governance settings. There's design, in the case of a region, is no individual endeavor, but a collective and collaborative process. And regional design is rarely guiding implementation. It takes place many steps before action on the regional scale. It rather is a planning activity that enhances institutional capacities for planning on regional and supra-regional levels of scale. And it has a strong spatial dimension. Spatial representations are a key element of regional design. So I want to give a first preliminary definition of regional design. Regional design is one or a bundle of spatial representations of a region that make use of their analytical, political, and organizational capacity and thus resembles a discourse. Communication is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the performance of regional design, and consequently regional design has a product dimension but also a process dimension. And as it is based on communication, it also has to integrate, this definition also has to integrate the actors that take part in this design process. This definition shall serve as a starting point for the discussion on the dimensions and performance of regional design, and our aim in the ongoing cooperation is to elaborate an analytical framework for the discussion of European case studies of regional design that will take place in parallel workshops during our conference. And this analysis and discussion we will do that in our conference. So we are in a working phase. We are still in the working phase now. So at this moment, I want to move from the discussion of regional design to the contribution of my PhD work. In my PhD thesis, I investigated into the impacts of communicative planning methods in relation to their different levels of design. I propose in my PhD an evolutionary perspective on the application and impact of communicative planning methods. And I think this perspective is also important for the discussion on regional design. planning is, just as design, a human activity by individuals, groups, and organizations that addresses individuals, groups, and organizations. And that's why planning and design, in my view, in this perspective that I draw, that it calls for a systemic perspective. From that point of view, communication is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the performance and impact of any planning activity. So in my PhD thesis, I developed a conceptual framework for the application and impact of communicative methods, communicative planning methods, and I then applied that framework in 2 empiric case studies. So I'd like to briefly introduce that conceptual model. This model tries to inform us about systems processes that drive or steer the application and impact of planning methods. And so this model is based on an evolutionary perspective. So first, planners or planning actors interact in a constellation of different planning institutions, and actors' constellation and interaction are influenced by an institutional context, by a specific planning context. The interaction of these actors results in an output of planning activities. For example, the application of a certain planning method. And what is the outcome or immediate short-term impact of that planning method? I distinguish in that model 2 levels of outcome. First, knowledge. In a very general perspective, the application of a planning method generates new collective knowledge about planning, the planning task at stake, maybe knowledge about problems, solutions, knowledge about processes, and that knowledge might be on an analytical, explicative, or normative level. And a second immediate outcome of this planning method might be arrangements. The actors involved might agree upon how to proceed. They might take spatial decisions or any kind of other arrangements. And in a systemic perspective, there's a third very important level of performance. The output of a planning method and its outcome of knowledge and arrangement, it generates a feedback loop. This feedback generates learning among planning actors, the actor constellation, or the institutional context. And by this feedback, the application of a planning method also influences all upcoming planning activities. So planning methods are applied in a temporal succession, step by step. And in such a sequence of methods, a visual representation or even a regional design might be designed and communicated. And in this dynamic perspective, the impacts of the different planning methods build upon one another. And this is the dynamic perspective makes the interplay of systems processes and system structures explicit. It is exactly that interplay of processes and structures that it is the basic idea of systems theory. So planning activities are influenced by the institutional context. I think this is what we all know, but in a long-term perspective, planning activities can change that context too. So this is an ongoing model that we have. This process is always going on. And finally, this sequence of our planning activities and their respective impacts, they also lead, of course, to the implementation of planning instruments and hopefully to their intended impact in the built and unbuilt environment. So I want to add another conceptual diagram, which with this diagram, we have a closer look at the system structures, the context. The context includes the planning actors, the actor constellation, and the institutional context. And especially at a regional scale, we have to be aware of in most cases, a very complex multi-actor setting. So in general, we can conceive that context at different levels. There are individual planners, there are groups or teams of planners working together, and there are organizations, planning organizations. And in most cases, spatial planning does not only involve one organization, but a constellation of organizations in a network or in a hierarchy. And this constellation does not operate in a vacuum, but operates within an institutional context. And that context provides an ethical, a legal, or maybe also a financial framework for planning. And this complex planning world interacts with the life world. Here we find the different political bodies, decision makers, as well as citizens, neighbors, and all kinds of other stakeholders and the public. So when we talk of collective learning or organizational learning and planning, as well as in regional design, we learn that learning might apply to all of these different levels of this complex context. In my PhD, I applied this model that is very general indeed in two empiric studies. The first study, this is on the left-hand side, is a meta-analysis of current planning literature. I analyzed 40 journal articles and identified 65 planning methods with their supposed impacts. And I carried out a qualitative and a quantitative content analysis of these methods, and visualization supported the pattern recognition in the qualitative dataset. The second empiric study focused on the analysis of a sequence of planning methods with their mutually interconnected impacts. So I have chosen an in-depth single case study of an ongoing planning process on the scale of a city quarter in Munich. This case study is the urban transformation process in the so-called creative quarter in Munich. I carried out a document analysis and interviewed 43 experts involved in the planning process, and for these experts, for these interviewees, I carefully chosen different perspectives, of course, within that planning process. And for the evaluation of the interviews, again, I applied a qualitative content analysis, and also in that case, visualizations are a means to detect argumentative structures within that interviews that suggest something like causes and effects of the methods applied. So, to give you an example of this work, I will present the story of the urban design competition in the creative quarter. So here you see part of a spatial representation of the first prize winning team in that competition. And if we want to understand what has happened within that urban design competition, we have to take a big step back. What larger story or context is that competition part of? Let's get an idea of the position of the creative quarter within the city of Munich. It's a 20 hectares brownfield development at a distance of 8 minutes by tramway from the central station. And when we compare the creative quarter with other urban development areas in Munich, we understand that this is a highly central but rather small development area. What makes the planning process special is its history. The creative quarter is no empty field. In the last 2 decades, the area has seen the rise and sometimes also the fall of numerous temporary users. There is an active scene of artists and of all kinds of creative people today. And at the same time, there have been a number of planning attempts that failed, planning projects that were stopped. So there's a treasure of experience, both positive and negative, at hand. And the time axis that I'm sure you cannot read it, but this is the time axis of the dynamics of the creative quarter for the last 100 years. This dynamics are shown in respect to the built environment, to the usages at this area, and as well in respect to the planning activities. So we can have a closer look, but I don't want to go into details here. So let's now zoom in the planning process in recent years. So this is, in my analysis, I understand that the urban design, I had to understand that the urban design competition, so this is framed in blue here, is only one out of 20 different planning methods that took place within a period of 5 years. We can consider this, what you see here, as a sequence of communicative planning methods. This timeline is the result of my empiric work. It is an ex post perspective on the planning process that took place, and during the case study it became evident to me that this sequence has not been master planned in advance, but it evolved in a step-by-step approach during the planning process. And in fact, I have chosen this planning process of the creative quarter for my single case study because of the richness and also the variety within that process. And I again want to zoom in. This section of the timeline shows the design competition. It is in German, but I will briefly explain you. We learned that the competition in itself is a process. It is a process in itself. It starts with an invitation of tenders. Participants are invited to a guided tour through the existing quarter. Public discussion takes place. The competition itself has 2 phases, and the process concludes with a public presentation and discussion of the winning concept and the exhibition also of all these winning designs. In total, the process of the design competition lasts for 10 months. But finally, what was the product of this competition? So the winning concept, this is what is shown here, proposes the development of the quarter in 4 distinct areas. Each area has a different program and identity. And what is special for Munich, the design acknowledges the existing building structure and interim uses in the northwest of the quarter, the so-called creative labor. By that, the design proposes a transformation process on the basis of the existing structure instead of a tabula rasa approach. The core idea is to enable in these 4 areas different speeds of urban development. A fast development in those parts of the area where there are empty fields, and to allow for slow development in those parts of the quarter where a careful development out of the existing urban structure is intended. And these different speeds are also an answer to the market pressure, to the high market pressure that challenges every urban development in Munich today. At least at the moment, you never know how that changes in the future. So at the end, these different speeds shall provide for different urban atmospheres within the creative quarter. And these spatial representations have played a key role in the opinion building process during the competition. So, in order to discuss the impact of the planning methods under investigation, I analyzed the argumentative structure within the 43 interviews, and this is a visualization of the database analyzed in a scheduling program. And then I consolidated these arguments and put them into a network. Again, this visualization is a tool during my research process. What did I find out in the case of the urban design competition? First of all, the competition process and the winning team changed the common understanding of the planning task at stake. Before, like in most other cases in Munich, the city quarter was conceived as a static product, a quarter with an intended final state. So the winning team introduced the notion of an ongoing transformation process, and in the eyes of this winning design, there will never be a final state of this quarter. And this happened, this was quite interesting, with a winning design that, strictly speaking, missed the tender documents. So the winning design ignored important demands of the tender, and nevertheless the jury unanimously adopted the project. So the outcome of the competition was a big surprise. This is what design can also do. It can surprise almost everybody involved in the process. The design proposal provoked and awaked the experts, politicians and users, and also the public. So the urban design proposition provoked a surprising turn in the whole process of the creative quarter. At the same time, with this surprising turn, the urban design proposition led to enormous uncertainty. Will the jury decision ever be supported politically, and what will be the next step, as everything is new? A decisive factor of success within the design competition was the time factor. That 10 months process was not only fruitful for the design teams involved, maybe the design teams might have worked even faster. It was this time factor, these 10 months, were particularly important for the process of opinion building within the jury, that this process gained from the long time span. And in the course of the competition, the opinion within the jury changed considerably, so you cannot detach the outcome of the competition from the organization of the working process during the competition. And why was this surprising turn possible? Almost all interviewees attribute that turn to the seductive power of the images. So the renderings promise vibrant urban spaces, and these images invite the jury to take heart, to take risk for a completely new approach. And once these seductive images circulate in the public, there's no way back. So now expectations in that case in Munich are extremely high. But the outcome of the design competition cannot be explained by the competition alone, neither from a product nor from a process perspective. The previous experience of the actors involved, they play a key role. In that area of the city, there have been already so many plans that failed. That's why the planners, the politicians, and the public are willing to take a major step forward. They are open for new ideas. And on the one hand, this is one really very important fact that allows for that success of the competition. And on the other hand, one has to consider that there's really also room for maneuver. The whole quarter is a public property, and this is also a necessary condition within the course of the competition. Another important role can be attributed to the pressure exerted by the interim users within the quarter. Among them are artists and a huge variety of different people and companies, and they turned against any tabula rasa approach, and they got widespread support in the public. Another factor of success is the design concept of the winning team itself. With the idea of an ongoing transformation process, the proposed urban layout by purpose is soft and fuzzy. The concept provides nothing more than a rough and approximate spatial framework, and by that postpones important and often conflicting spatial decisions. And this strategy is the formula for success from a political perspective. And finally, what about the follow-up of the competition? What happens afterwards? How did the urban design proposal inform the following planning process? Above all, the design proposal raises more questions than it gives answers. With the idea of this ongoing transformation process, that is also triggered by a portion of self-organization within the quarter, existing planning approaches are inadequate. Munich's state-of-the-art planning routines cannot be applied anymore. So instead of giving clear answers to organizational issues, the design challenges current planning practice. So the design is just a starting point or a trigger for a self-imposed learning process. So what kind of conclusions can we draw from the analysis of the performance of the urban design competition? So from that communicative perspective, urban design is much more than the layout of an intended spatial pattern. It can be shown here, this can be shown here for the spatial scale of a city quarter, and at that level of scale, we are of course very familiar with master plan approaches to design. Nevertheless, even in that case, urban design draws its performance of its ambiguous role between analytical, normative, and organizational capacity. And I think a simple instrumental perspective on urban design falls short. Urban design cannot be reduced to a blueprint or master plan of an intended spatial structure. That would suppose that urban design was just one step before action and implementation. Instead, urban design propels learning processes among the actors involved, design changes the understanding of the planning task at stake, it changes the goals and the rules of the game, and it fosters opinion-building processes among the a large variety of actors involved. So the performance of urban design has to be assessed in the context of that evolutionary perspective on urban development and governance. But let's again have a more general view on the performance or impact of communicative planning methods. If we put all empiric evidence together, but what can be stated? The systemic perspective reveals that there is never just one effect, but a bundle of intended and unintended effects. Effects go beyond simple ends and means relationships. The generation of shared knowledge, new arrangements on organizational learning are mutually interdependent. That can be shown in both empiric studies. The effects influence each other. There are strong linkages between the different kinds of effects. They show a time lag, and short-term, mid-term, and long-term effects do not necessarily coincide. Communicative methods, they may change the institutional context and stimulate these multidimensional collective learning processes. And this suggests that communicative planning methods shall be understood as a practice of systemic intervention. Effects can only be stimulated, not determined, and effects show complex dynamics and momentum. So this is one level of the results. At the same time, this systemic perspective clearly demonstrates that for a successful planning process, planners and designers have to simultaneously take into account different levels of design. First, the individual planning method with its basic building blocks. This can also be a plan or a spatial visualization. In that case, we maybe call it a design product. Second, the sequence of methods of the individual method or spatial representation is part of. At that level, design is a process. Third, influencing variables that significantly impact on the performance of the planning methods within that sequence. And fourth, at the same time, there are, of course, in every design project, important limitation for every design endeavor. There are external factors of the context that cannot be influenced and changed. So, finally, the question, what could that, maybe better than does that, what could that mean for regional design? Regional design, in my opinion, has a product and a process dimension. Design takes place in a specific setting or context. And the performance of regional design can be understood as a feedback loop into that same setting and context. And there can be a next round, further regional design cycles, and that step-by-step fuel regional learning processes. So I want to conclude with this sketchy outlook, and I feel that despite all these slides, many questions, or most questions, remain unanswered. And I'm looking forward to the joint discussion, and many thanks for